Awesome. So how many that are in attendance today were at the most recent Summer Strong presentation I did? Okay, nice. So some of it will be a review for you guys and girls, and then some of it will, hopefully be new, or we'll take a slightly different twist on it. So for those that kind of need a little bit of a background from me, that aren't 100% sure where I came from athletically or what my deal was, or why I'm even speaking about optimizing the hour. I came through athletics. I was track and field guy, got scholarships to the US, did the whole collegiate system. I got injured pretty bad in college, just random bad luck. Oddly enough, John and I had the same injury. We both had a mid-patellar rupture, all right? Probably had it roughly at the same time. I think I beat him to it. His was left, mine was right, so we're patellar rupture twins. But it was similar to his situation. It was during that time that I started to go down the road of human performance. Reason being, I had 1 year of eligibility left, right? So I kind of squeaked out of that year of rehab. Junior year was obviously a write-off. Squeak into my senior year, coming out of this mid-patellar rupture deal. And even though it was a very strange injury for me as a hammer thrower, even though I couldn't jog, couldn't jump, still struggled to walk downstairs, whatever the nature was, right leg, of throwing an implement in a circular fashion like that, for some reason I could still do it. So I ended up squeezing out an All-American on a body that couldn't walk downstairs. Made no sense, but the body's a funny thing, and that's what happened. But when it ended up happening after that, because it was my senior year, I was thrown into a situation where I was going to lose the Barella support system of NCAAs, right? So now, no trainers, no rehab. University of Wyoming was basically done with me. And because I'd competed that season, I was out of their recovery system. But like most people, life goes on. So what I did is I took a job that first year out of college at Eastern Michigan University as a track and field coach. Coached the throwing events, coached human performance, basically piecing together what I'd learned in my collegiate system. Luckily, my first 2 years at a JUCO, I had phenomenal Olympic lifting coaches that just coincidentally happened to be a part of our program. But when I got to Wyoming, I had very average everything because I wasn't coached by then head strength coach Scott Bennett. Our throws coach was our weightlifting coach. He was not the greatest. Reason why I broke my foot and blew out my knee as a hammer thrower in college. It made no sense, right? But over voluming an athlete continuously, and if they're hard of head enough that they will do it, injuries tend to follow, right? We used to refer to our program as the crocodile program of collegiate track and field. Those that survived it would be Olympians. We had 4 in 04, and those that didn't became extinct like the rest of the dinosaurs, right? That's how they coached us out. So the crocodiles were the Olympians. They survived extinction. Everybody else took a dirt nap, myself included. So that next year at Eastern Michigan, what ended up happening is I was on my own accord. I was a first-time collegiate coach, and I had the incredible resources of working full-time to the tune of about $12,000 a year, right? Your standard first-year coaching Ypsilanti, Michigan wage, right? But during that year, what ended up happening, so this would have been like 01 into 02, I had to turn on my own brain power to try to solve the solution, because at the time my knee was still kind of dysfunctional. Couldn't run without this really weird, messed up gait. It was like a wheel with a bend in it on a bicycle. That's how I moved. But, social media started to become a thing that existed in its very rudimentary forms. So you had things like Testosterone Nation that went from a magazine to an online forum, if guys and gals remember that far back. And when you had those early days of T-Mag, this is pre-Elite FTS, pre-Jim Wendler, pre-Dave Tate even. This is going to be like the early days of like TC Loma and Charles Poliquin and names now that Charles has since passed. It's so long, right? But what it did do is it opened us up to being able to get online and start searching and not fabricated, hey, I'm going to tell you a story about this supplement related to this barbell movement, and the end result is you buy my product, strength and conditioning, right? Which is what we're dealing with a lot now because of social media. This was, hey, remember that article from the NCAA journal from 1982? Yeah, can you scan that and put it online, right? That's the type of information that we were getting back then. So I started to rehab myself using principles and practices that were, investigated by myself, but I went out of my way to track them down and put them together. So that year I started that process. And for the very first time in my human performance life, I actually did a proper GPP cycle. I actually took the time to rehab. I took the time to progress through. I've talked about this on the podcast, but I was a naive, strong athlete, meaning which I never tested my squat, and I know John hates this story, but I never tested my squat under 420 in my life, right? I was 15 years old, turning 16, competed in a powerlifting meet, never having squatted, and I squatted 420. Had no clue what that meant, right? But what it did do is it showed that I had aptitude for performance, the genetic aspect, but I had no geography and I had no influences in my life at that time. So what ended up happening is at the age of like 21, coming out of college, is when I actually learned how to lift weights. I just did it before that. I just went into the gym and I did things, and I had the ability to express those things athletically. So when I started educating myself on human performance, I realized that there was a science to it, but not just a science. It's like Buddy Morris told me years later in the NFL, is there's also an art to how you put all that information together. You can have all the textbook in the world, but if you can't paint the picture with the athlete, you're going to have a very difficult time getting that athlete to express the outcome of all that information, right? So it was when I was 21, 22, I started to take all this information, correlate through it, and be like, okay, how do I draw this to create this mosaic that's going to eventually be human performance? And at the time, totally self-serving. My athletes were getting a little bit of that, but for me, I was still very much in the mindset of, man, I'm still pretty messed up from this injury and I'm pretty young. So during that year is when I started to collect information, started to seek the seekers, started to spend my time around people that I'd then think of as mentors. And I was actually able to get back to a human performance level that was pretty good, that opened some doors. The first door that opened was Judd Logan at Ashland University. And when I went through that door, that's what, in a very short sentence, going to Ashland University is the reason that I'm giving you this presentation right now. Okay, so it was one of those doors that behind that door was so vast and so never ending that, I would have never predicted it. But what he did do is he introduced me in real time to guys like Charles Poliquin. And when I started working with Poliquin, it wasn't as one of his coaches selling supplements or doing any of that. It was actually as an athlete. So my first introduction to a guy like Poliquin is like a very non-committal sense. Like I went to him as, I hear this French Canadian guy can teach me how to win, right? That was a totally different relationship than, Charles Poliquin, the guru, right? Like there's a different psychology there, because if he couldn't help me, I didn't care about him, right? I was very much athletic-based mindset. So I was very critical of early day Poliquin information. So we go down to Arizona, Poliquin Group, all that stuff didn't exist yet. And we go into his office, me and Judd, and Judd's like, hey, I got this athlete I'm going to start training post-collegiately. He coached for a year, but he ditched that because he wants one more shot at making Team Canada. What can we do? And that's when I was introduced to the entire concept of, which, I now term optimizing the hour, of everything. What's your sleep, right? What Doc just talked about. What's your sleep? What's your pregame? What's your nutritional protocols? What are you doing first thing in the morning? What are you doing last thing at night? A strange question that Poliquin asked me in 2002 was, do you play a lot of violent video games, right? And at the time, I was like, no, meanwhile, everybody played first-person shooter games, right? Reason being, it was disrupting my cortisol curve, right? Because I'd play them at night before I went to bed, right? All these things I didn't understand at the time, but they were a part of this conversation, right? And now, you go back and use the artistic mind and put together the mosaic of information. But it put me down this road of how all these parts started to play in. And it's like, well, what are the other 22 or 23 hours of the day? have to do with optimizing the hour? What does any of that information have to do? It has everything to do, because you are trying to make the best of a 60-minute, maybe 120-minute window where you're trying to get maximal performance out of yourself or your athlete. Meanwhile, they have 22, 23, 21 other hours of the day to completely disrupt everything that you're trying to do, right? And that's when I started to look at everything as a much more holistic, big picture thing, working down to the micro, which is at the essence, the actual training session, right? And so then over the next 20 years, up to this, 2021, it's been putting in and pulling out pieces of that puzzle to see what works best, what doesn't work at all, what aspects of sports supplementation, which we'll talk heavily about today, I can actually manipulate in those athletes that have a disrupted 22 hours of their day. What can I do to just try to offset that? How do I offset my athletes? And this is a real story. So this isn't a fabricated like, oh, what if? I had an athlete come in on a Tuesday at a school in Southern Colorado. He's a freshman, up and coming shot putter, first semester, and is like, hey coach, can we talk? And I'm like, practice starts in 5 minutes. What is it? And he's like, he goes, my girlfriend's pregnant. And me being slightly autistic, I'm like, shit, that's crazy. All right, let's go to practice, right? But then part of my brain was thinking about it during practice. I'm like, man, this guy just told me life-altering news. I'm like, I wonder if I should do anything about it. And to which eventually I sat him down. I'm like, well, what's our game plan, right? And that conversation came later. But that is like, holy shit, that was happening all the time as a coach. And then when I started traveling and lecturing to coaches worldwide, I realized they were dealing with that all the time. It could be anything from, military service injuries to like our world-class athletes that right before the Olympics tore a groin and game over. Like all these different factors come into play. Those are your worst case scenarios from those two worlds. And then you have your best case scenarios where maybe an athlete is trying to balance out the Olympic Games with, where they're going to live and money introductions to their life and things like this. And all that disrupts those 22, 23 hours. So when we stepped back and we looked at that as a whole, we realized that, and I always preempt this with, I never give nutritional advice because I'm not a dietitian. I never worked in that world. I was on the mechanical nuts and bolts, muscles and tissues and weight side as a therapist. So we'd send them away, we'd get them sorted out nutritionally, we'd get them on the right program, we'd figure out what they needed to take care of that nuts and bolts. But then from a pure, my job is to help someone win mindset, it was, how do we take this athlete and maximize the things that they just simply may not be getting enough of to ensure that we're recovering to the best of our abilities and getting us back to the place that we need to do it again. And that's when I started talking about things like human performance or success on the field or change in muscle tissue or growth is a hypertrophy situation, is we chase, as coaches, we chase human performance through the window of restoration, right? So what we do as coaches and as human performance guides is we are trying to get the athlete to progress at a rate greater than they possibly could have through natural circumstance by using external influence. You perform and improve at the rate of restoration. So how quickly you can recover before your next session is going to be one of the biggest determiners, for example, in an Olympic athlete's life, whether or not they have success or failure, okay? So for example, let's use a complete arbitrary fake number, but let's say a javelin thrower in the Olympics in that 4-year window, regardless of strength, regardless of any of those factors, okay? It doesn't matter what their close grip snatch is, for example, even though that, or split snatch, shit that seems made up, right? But regardless of what that is, let's say that in 4 years, the standard that was set is an athlete has to achieve 50,000 repetitions with the javelin to be able to be good enough to make an Olympics. So from 0 to 4 years, if they do 45,000, they don't make the team. If they do 50,001, guaranteed success, okay? So if you use a completely arbitrary scenario like that, what we start to realize is the athlete that has the greatest potential for success is the one that can recover quick enough between exposures to stimulus that they can then do the stimulus again and get the volume required and exposure to sport and skill to be successful, to be technically proficient, okay? And so the only way that you can do that, and the only way that you can ensure that they have the capacity to tolerate the volume, is recovery and restoration. Either mechanical, massage, hydrotherapy, cold tub, heat exposure, dietitian nutrition, supplementation, okay? You have to start looking at that to speed up that window so that it's a +1 during their next training session and not like a -5, right? Like Doc just talked about the fact that, you know, you sleep 6 hours as a normal human, you sleep 6 hours, you're at a 25% deficit. Times that over 4 to 8 years, right? So that's just the sleep factor, right? And anyone that went to college or has a real job knows that sleep is a commodity that's very valuable, right? And we typically never get enough of it, right? Maybe you're working split shifts, right? Maybe you're patrolling all night long for 2 weeks and then you're like, oh, back to days for 2 weeks. And your body's like, well, I don't know what to do about this sleep thing, right? And over the course of a 20-year career, the detriment is massive, okay? So even though we can't always do things about that, it's how do we maximize the things we can control, okay? So that's kind of the short and dirty of what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. So in a world of fractions of a second, the difference between winning and watching happens at the micro level, optimizing the hour. So what that means to me, especially from a human performance standpoint, is you can look like a quadriannual cycle, you can look like macros, mesos, you can do all that programming magic, all of it. It has to be done. You have to think big picture. You have to think about the big things that are coming down the road so you have a general direction to move. But at the end of the day, every single successful athlete or person, especially, and we'll keep it in terms of human performance for the sake of clarity, but every single successful athlete maximizes the 1 hour every day or the 2 hours every day. The reason being is it's because the thing that you have the most direct influence over, right? I can talk about going to the Olympics in 2000, in 1999, not knowing that I was going to be bedridden for 6 months in January of 2000, right? There's no way I could have predicted that. So I can hypothesize that I'm going to the Olympics, but at the micro level, right, it didn't make a difference. I ended up spending that entire year in rehab, okay? So that became my micro focus, okay? So when we start talking specifically about sports supplementation for the sake of maximizing or optimizing that hour, these are some big key takeaways. And the big thing I wanted to kind of hit you guys with is what can I start to manipulate? What can I start to use today? What can I start to look into and why, from an external influence standpoint, that maybe will make that hour at the micro level more successful, okay? And this is a big thing that prior to, say, the Poliquin Performance Education platform that came out, this is what was taught to Judd and I when we were still just athletes, just training, talking to Charles eons ago. And everything he talked about was pre, intra, and post-workout, either supplementation, this is what this will be initially, supplementation for the sake of increasing not only mechanical activation, the ability to move, load, but also psychological or neural activation so that we had the desire every single day to do the hard thing. Does that make sense? Like, it's not just enough to be recovered enough to train, but you have to have enough of the right things happening in your body so that you have the desire to do the difficult thing every day, right? And sometimes that difficult thing, it's not like, oh God, I have to go lift weights. It's, I've had 3 tests today and I have to lift at 4 o'clock. It's like, holy shit, I have nothing left psychologically, but I know coaches got us at 85% for triples in the power clean, right? And you're just like, Okay, how do I get there? Well, you know, in 2021 bullshitville, it's a shitload of caffeine and a bunch of stuff that people sell for the sake of a sensation. But in real human performance, it's making sure that you have the adequate neurotransmitters in place through a proper diet initially, and then addition to supplementation that actually makes a difference. So when we started to break this down, what the focus one is activation, right? Things that you're doing to ensure that you have the best opportunity to have the most neurological connection and brain function to what you're doing training wise, right? So when we look at this, I break it down as neuro drive, muscle drive, metabolic drive. Okay, I keep it super simple. When I look at neuro drive, I look at things like acetyl L-carnitine, tyrosine, and caffeine. Okay, so there's a lot of ways to be super fancy with supplementation to increase neural activation, that 1 hour window before you train. But these are tried and true neurotransmitters. Things like the doc had talked about, cortisol, right? Increasing adrenaline, norepinephrine, epinephrine, right? So and this is kind of nice that I can piggyback his information. He talks about the cortisol curve being on an uptrend as you wake up. Stress gets you up in the morning. Cortisol wakes you up to go hunt and feed yourself. It's a primitive mechanism that has never gone away. It's essential for us to be functional humans. Now, we may not have to hunt the woolly mammoth anymore, but maybe our woolly mammoth is that training session. So we want to do things to stimulate cortisol going into that training session. Cortisol is athletic, focused, productive. You don't want to live there, but you sure need it to get going in the morning and get revved up for a training session. So when we look at some of these neurologics like tyrosine, drives epinephrine, right? Tyrosine drives norepinephrine, adrenaline, caffeine. What does caffeine stimulate the shit out of, which is good and bad? Anyone? Bueller? Cortisol. Caffeine and cortisol are good buddies, right? So caffeine will do wonders to drive cortisol, right? Which will get you focused for training. We know from studies that now are 30, 40 years old, caffeine will have a positive benefit up to 2% increase in maximal strength in the moment for a training session, right? It's why they banned it. They didn't ban it because it didn't work. The only reason they don't still ban it is because they figured out the metabolization of caffeine is so different from person to person, there's no way to actually test for it at the Olympic level, right? I drink a Starbucks as, you know, a Swedish northerner, and I'm going to be agitated for 4 hours because of how my liver metabolizes caffeine. Whereas another athlete could have a different genotype background, genetic heritage, and caffeine is in and out of their liver in 15 to 20. So I'm testing positive at the Olympics and they're not. So that's why caffeine is no longer a tested product, right? But it doesn't mean that it still doesn't have that incredible stimulation. Now, from a health standpoint, acetyl L-carnitine, because it passes the blood-brain barrier, right, as a stimulatory effect, we can use it to increase neurological health, but it's also a protective for degeneration of brain, right? It's Alzheimer's and dementia and some of these other things. It helps keep that at bay, right? Muscle drive. Now, this is where we get into like L-carnitine and creatine, right? Creatine will hit a little bit harder in the next slide, but L-carnitine will actually increase the rate in which you metabolize glucose, and it decreases the hypoxic nature of aerobic training, right? L-carnitine has huge benefit to improving the metabolic function even of an athlete that has an aerobic component to their training. It will increase mental focus and drive to training, but it'll also starve off fatigue, especially as you start to get into heavy fatty acid oxidation, right? So that one is going to be muscle drive. It's going to increase the ability to do work. Creatine monohydrate. Creatine monohydrate was isolated in 1832. Some say 1835, but it's the same guy. He gets two dates, right? But it's been around forever. The thing that John and I talk a lot about is the fact that creatine is neuroprotective, right? So with all the crap that went on during the late 90s, early 2000s with the phosphagen days and the muscle tech days, where people were taking huge amounts and then getting poor training quality on the field, get dehydrated and having heat stroke, The only thing they thought that changed because it became famous was creatine. So they're like, it was creatine's fault this kid got dehydration and had to take him to the hospital. Not considering the fact that it was probably the other 22 hours where he didn't drink any water, didn't eat any food, probably had a poor sleep cycle, and the coach kept him out in 100-degree heat for 4.5 hours, right? And water breaks were a privilege and treated as a punishment. Remember that whole era, right? So they had to blame someone, so creatine got thrown into that. Now, all these years later, creatine monohydrate in particular, not only is it neuroprotective, but they've found that it protects the brain from heat stroke, right? So the very thing it got bastardized for in the late 90s, early 2000s, if they weren't using it, they probably would have had symptoms sooner, right? So that's something to consider. Metabolic drive, beta-alanine, CoQ10, and phosphatidylcholine. The phospholipid group is essential for healthy brain function. And it's also essential for making sure that you're protected and recovering from the hard driving demands of training. When I go back and then look at CoQ10, right? CoQ10 in studies has now been shown that taken anywhere from 400 to 600 milligrams not only repairs cardiac damage following a heart attack, but dramatically increases mitochondria function and the ability to be able to sustain hard driving effort, right? Simple stuff. None of it's flashy. You're not going to feel yourself using it. But not only does it keep you healthy as you age, but it also gives you the actual energy sources that you need to be extremely successful in the weight room and on the field, okay? And then moving back to beta-alanine. Beta-alanine is an interesting one. Who here has used beta-alanine consistently? Yeah, almost everybody, right? I always think of beta-alanine as the cousin to the creatine marketing cycle. So they were able to market the shit out of creatine. And creatine, because there actually was a functional response to the use of creatine, if you used a high enough dose, you would get what? Cellular water retention, increase in short-term strength gains due to the hydraulic nature of a muscle cell filling with fluid. And it had a similar, although benign, resemblance to steroid use, right? So if you used a significant amount of creatine over time, you would start to get that strength gain in the weight room that was kind of like being on a cycle of D-ball, right? So they started to market it that way. Beta-alanine, when it came along, the research was actually better for human performance, but the problem is it didn't give weight room-based athletes that same biofeedback, right? They didn't feel and swell, and Bobby Skinny Legs doesn't get on the scale and have it go up 5 pounds over the course of 4 weeks. But what it did do is it buffered lactate. Not only does it buffer lactate, but they started to find in studies in 05 and 06 that athletes that stayed on it from 3 to 4 weeks and tried to keep the dose below the pins and needles, right? That was the big thing. I felt the pins and needles, it must be working. Nah, you just took a bit too much. So when you start to look at beta-alanine, the studies in 05 and 06 that were done with a wrestling team showed, and then eventually track athletes, that if they were hitting like lactate threshold at like 305 meters running a 400 meter track, what it was doing is after the system became saturated, they were able to push through to say 325, 340 before they got the same amount of lactate sensation, right, hitting the wall. So as they're starting to crest that corner and really got shut down by it, well, the corner now has moved 30 meters, which means they're able to carry speed longer, decrease in time it takes to run the total race, making them a faster 400 meter runner, right? So if you extrapolate that out to athletics as a whole, it allows you to tolerate hard driving training, HIIT style training in particular, that is that 30 to 65 second window, and you're able to get more work per period of time, which if you go all the way back to what we said, if you can get more repetitions in over the course of 4 years, you're going to be more successful.
Is that there was a time where a lot of track coaches use like a Tums to be like more acidic?
Right. So
is that kind of like the same buffer?
So carbonate.
Yeah.
So it's the same theory, but it's basically just not as effective. right? So the idea of using baking soda, which was the original, right? Using baking soda and water, drinking it buffers lactate to allow the athlete to not become so acidic so quickly. It absolutely works. And there's still coaches and athletes that use it. The problem is the gastral distress is so high, it's unpredictable. Beta-alanine, you're not gonna shit your pants, right? I mean, that's at the end of the day, that's the conversation that really needs to be had. If you are, you probably had tons of pins and needles before and you probably took too much, right? So beta-alanine is going to do the same, but it's going to be much easier on the body. It's more expensive, for sure, but definitely easier on the body. When we move to the next phase, which is focus 2, this is kind of piggybacking again, intra, right? Things that you're going to use to affect the actual moment of training, flow states, things of that nature. When I think of flow state, I think of things that are basically brain protective. Ginkgo, phosphatidylserine, and bacopa, okay? These are herbs or naturals that you would use that protect the brain from stress. Things that allow, like ginkgo, we know increases blood flow to the actual brain itself, right? Allowing it to improve what we would think of as executive function. So we know that people that take ginkgo biloba can tolerate information better under stress, right? It's one of the reasons they also give it to aging brains is because of the increased vascular activity. But think of it this way. You're gassing your athlete, just gassing them, and it has to be done because they're an 800-meter runner. Or maybe it's a more complex sport. And when they're in the shit, you have to also communicate. The research shows is athletes that can tolerate more information under duress, which is hard to do, and remember it, have a greater consequence to remembering it when they're recovering in what we think of as like the programming state. So after the training session is done, all the stress hormones come back down. When they're relaxed, the brain starts to put the pieces together. It's like when you show someone how to play the piano, and when they're sitting there, they play it next to you as they mimic you. Then the next day, they can't play it at all when they're by themselves, and then like 2 days later, it's back because the brain has to put those pieces of information together. Okay, ginkgo helps that. Phosphatidylserine in particular, we just talked about this with Doc. It's cortisol resistant, right? So they know from studies, 600 milligrams a day of phosphatidylserine will inverse the testosterone cortisol ratio, right? So you will crush cortisol and drive up testosterone from phosphatidylserine. We also know that using phosphatidylserine decreases the buildup of cortisol and how it affects the brain over the course of the training session. Does that make sense? Okay. Metabolics, okay, still comes back. Beta-alanine. I can't talk about this one enough. It just doesn't get enough play. Anybody that's doing metabolic work and they want their athletes to tolerate it better, take beta-alanine. It'll do wonders over time, and it's one of those rare supplements where when you remove it from the athlete's exposure, it doesn't immediately go away. We know that creatine's drop-off points very quickly once you remove it from their diet. It takes a little while for beta-alanine to saturate, but on the inverse, it takes a little while for the beta-alanine to run itself back out again, okay? It stores very well. L-citrulline, again, it's a vasodilator, derivative of watermelon, okay? So L-citrulline malate is roughly the consumable dose of watermelon that you would have to eat to get that, I think it's 5 grams, is something like 5 kilos of watermelon, right? So, you know, I've seen people try, but I'd recommend the supplement over it. That's going to be a natural vasodilator that's not going to compete with other things going on in terms of the training cycle. Like the problem with L-arginine, even though it is an effective vasodilator, one of the issues we have with L-arginine when we take it during training is the fact that it competes for growth hormone release. So they did all these studies that showed that L-arginine pre-workout increased the growth hormone by something like 300%, right? Which is pretty cool. But what the study left out is the fact that without taking L-arginine, typical growth hormone release during a training session was 300 to 500% regardless. But where L-arginine is actually really effective with growth hormone releases during your pre-sleep cycle. L-arginine before bed is fantastic as a natural vasodilator. and an upregulator of growth hormone release. It's really beneficial, like up to the neighborhood of 500 or 600% improvement over non-growth or non-supplemented state, okay? And then, of course, essential amino acids, BCAAs, and B6. Everyone's crapping on those again on social media, but the truth is amino acids will and always have had a place with recovery of tissue. It's just basically ensuring that you're filling in the gaps that they may be losing out on. It's one of those mindsets where if you can control as many variables as possible, that it'll decrease the chances for the athlete's failure, right? So if you're like, hey, make sure you got your BCAAs, or especially it has to be a nice blend, not just BCAAs, but like EAAs or BCAAs, and you're like, make sure you're drinking those every workout. Is it really going to be the game changer? Probably not. But you know what it does ensure is that every day, 4 days a week, 5 days a week, they're getting branched chain amino acids and essential amino acids under your watch, right? Because if they're with you and they got their shaker cup and it has some product in it, you know that they're at least getting something done, right? From the neuroprotective standpoint. Focus 3, post-facilitation. We look at L-taurine, or taurine, right? Vitamin C and L-glutamine as my big 3 right off the top. Taurine in particular is neuroprotective, but also Dr. Serrano was once quoted as saying, an athlete deficient in taurine will not gain any muscle over time from their training. So it's a sign that the tissue doesn't have the necessary amino acid for recovery. L-taurine is also very good at dealing with stress to the heart, right? So if you have someone that's always got like AFib or some sort of issue or stress-related tachycardia, make sure that they're getting significant amount of taurine in that scenario to help cardioprotective, especially along with the CoQ10. The vitamin C, again, fighting cortisol, right? Vitamin C is one of the few that we were told about right from the very beginning from the US Olympic Committee, even though I'm Canadian, where our training group, going back even 20 years, were like, post-workout vitamin C suppresses the cortisol curve, right? So as cortisol is continuing to elevate post-workout, now we have to start to curve that and get it going back down into rest, digest, or rest or eat and sleep psychology. And we're trying to stunt that cortisol as quickly as possible so we can get back into an anabolic state of existence. Vitamin C still has an active role in that, right? And this is something that isn't very sexy, so it doesn't get a lot of attention. But athletes at the highest level are still doing post-vitamin C workout. It's super beneficial. It's also the reason why when we look at therapy clinics that can go 10 grams or above intravenously, because it doesn't get disrupted and cause stomach distress, you know, up to 50 grams for most cancer burn treatment, we see a massive anabolic effect from that. We saw, and it's a weird example to use, but professional bodybuilders, because they're so finite in how lean they are, any sort of deviation typically shows up. And one of my clients that I had was like a natural Miss Olympia, so drug-tested Miss Olympia in her 40s. And she had trained and trained and trained, and then, yeah, she started dating my brother back in the day. So I was like, hey, have you ever tried intravenous vitamin C? So we introduced that. I didn't do it myself, but we sent her to a clinic, and that's the only thing that we changed the last 4 weeks. And she was, based on the past 6 years of competing, she ended up being 4 weeks ahead of where she thought she was going to be. Like, it just radically sped up. One, how it affects insulin and glycogen into the tissue, and the other is controlling cortisol from that hard, stressful training made her more anabolic and actually put her ahead of the curve, guys. When I worked with Ben Pekalski, same thing. That was a big part of his protocol going into the Mr. Olympia. L-glutamine, obviously, L-glutamine is going to be very good for the stomach health of the athlete. So, we're not going to get into the nutrition stuff, but a stomach that can't digest nutrition, it can't absorb micronutrients, can't uptake neurotransmitters, the whole system gets broken, right? It's like, it's like people talk about thinking with their stomach or a gut feeling. The reason we do that is because a lot of the neurotransmitters that we are using for mental function, it's all coming from the stomach. It's all coming from our digestion. If you have an inefficient digestive system, right, or, at the most complex level, like holes in the digestive tract and leaky gut syndrome, glutamine will help with that. It'll help heal and improve the immune system. And in doing so, will protect you from stress hormones, increase upregulation of the absorption of nutrient. All of those things are affected from the stomach. So if you can heal the gut and keep it healthy and keep healthy bowel function, you're going to have all your other issues start to iron themselves out, okay? And then obviously magnesium, L-theanine. Now here's what's interesting. Dr. Parsley Sleep Aid, all of this in the recovery section, almost all of it is in that supplement, right? And I don't know if anyone's used it yet at night. It should have been in your bags. I used it last night. Magnesium, in his supplement, biglycinate and oxide, right, are his two variations of magnesium in that product. Biglycinate has an incredible ability to pass the blood-brain barrier, right? So of all the different magnesiums in existence, they all kind of have different things that they're beneficial for. Like magnesium tetrate is really good for the heart, right? Magnesium biglycinate is really good for the brain, right? So you have to start looking at these things, if they're good enough for that type of product and what he's using it for. If you're not starting to integrate it into your recovery protocols, you could be missing out on a huge amount of how the system restores during your sleeping phases. And it's going to increase the rate in which you rest, right? It's going to make you a better sleeper. L-theanine as well, suppressant of the nervous system, increase of melatonin, increase of 5-HTP from L-theanine. All these things are going to upregulate restoration. The key to sleep is to be consistent with the routine, but also to sleep deeply when you do. Okay? Now, if I was just to put together some protocols, and please take a picture of this or get it from wherever, these are how I would put your protocol together during the day. A weights and sprints or a metabolic duration. Now, it can be obviously the same thing depending on what is happening with an athlete. So you'll see that I slightly emphasize certain things just for clarity, but for the most part, it correlates and overrides, okay? Now, a couple things in here that aren't in the initial breakdown, okay, is Gaba, right? So Gaba is going to increase the ability for the neuron to speak to the brain, but it's also a suppressive and a restorative neurotransmitter, best used at night to help you sleep and recover, okay? That one, along with the theanine, arginine, magnesium, and taurine, is great for restoration, okay? The other ones that weren't in the initial slides, obviously protein supplementation post-workout, okay? I'm still a big fan of a fast-digesting post-workout protein source. Two reasons. One, keeps people rigid. Like, let's be honest, there's athletes that their only protein they're getting a day is that post-workout shake that you saw them drink. The rest of the day is a shit show, right? So you want to make sure that between the Doritos and pancakes that they're getting something, okay? So that is a big one for that aspect. Everything else you have seen before. Bacopa in particular is one of the oldest trees on the planet. And Bacopa, when consumed, has an incredible ability to protect against the development of Alzheimer's and dementia with athletes and with general population. Bacopa is one that is just good neuroprotective, okay? The only change I make here is in the metabolic duration is adding simple carbohydrate optional with the post-metabolic window, depending on the athlete, their goals, and honestly, their body fat level, right? For me right now, probably don't need those simple carbs post-workout, I'm not gonna lie, right? 6 months from now, we might be having a different conversation. Does that make sense? So it's gonna be very athlete specific, and that's why it says optional, okay? Any questions about these two slides?
That has a lot of this in it. Is it not enough to be useful?
So I'm sponsored by Monster, right? So I'll be 100% honest. When Monster took me on, I was like, "Oh, really, dude?" You know, like I was like, "How do I fit your brand?" They're like, "Oh, your activities, like you ski 95 days a year and blah blah blah." And I'm like, "Oh, so you don't want me to talk about what it does?" They're like, "No, man, we're a recreation brand. That was the true story. Now, that's the truth. They have no desire to be associated with sports performance at all. And this was including Monster, like Monster Sport. They're like, no, that's not our world. You know, we're a recreational drink brand. This is what you drink when you recreate, right? And I'm like, okay. So then I took a step back and I was like, okay, so I'm just going to drink it for flavor and fun. What it does have a ton of, caffeine, right? And so at the end of the day, the benefit, and it goes back to if someone is, you know, because I'm a full admitter of the drinker of the diet sodas, have been my whole life, and drink coffee. But if someone was to go to me, you know, I just don't like coffee, but I need caffeine or an upper, it's like the Jeff Nichols model, right? Drink a Monster. It's just a different flavor of coffee as far as I'm concerned. As much as people are like, but coffee comes from the earth and it's a bean of you know, environmental friendliness. This is bullshit, right? Most coffee has fecal matter in it by the time it gets to your cup from McDonald's. I hope Power Athlete doesn't post that, but it's true, right? Like when they go and do all these tests of all this thing, nothing is perfect, right? But if I was to say, hey, you know, if you're a Monster drinker, just know that it's going to be caffeine driven, pretty significant boost of vitamin B, right, of variable forms. And because of that, it will disrupt sleep after this hour of the day if you're constantly consuming it. But if you're a morning to midday consumer of Monster and you don't have any negative effects, and they're like, well, what about all the extras in it like taurine? Well, all taurine does is help buffer the effect of the caffeine so it actually clears the system a little quicker and people are ready to drink more. It's kind of a catch-22, right? So when you look at it that way, you just have to understand what it is you're drinking and are you drinking it for the right reason, right? If you're drinking it for flavor and for a little pick-me-up, it's America. Does that help? Yeah. All right. Any other questions based on this? Oh, sorry.
How important do you feel like let's say you have some blood work on an athlete, the chronic levels of some of the micronutrients like vitamin C and magnesium are good.
Yep.
Just the acute spike.
Yeah. All you're trying to do is to put more into the system so that they have a better chance at super exceeding their body's need for training, meaning which we can't take anabolic steroids at the Olympics, right? We know they work. We know they work really well. That's why we can't take them, right? That's a black and white look at what they do. Anabolic steroids do not make athletes better, period. It's a weird thing to say, but then when you backtrack it, you're like, well, then what do? They decrease the window of restoration so you can do 2 to 4 to 6 times the amount of work that a non-anabolically assisted athlete can do. So in a 4-year window, that athlete gets to that 75,000 reps instead of 50,000 reps and increases their ability to have mastery of performance. Now, you can get into the minutia and say, well, yeah, but certain anabolics increase neurological firing patterns and it makes an athlete more capable of expression of fast rate muscle twitch, right? Yeah, all that's true. I get that. Still banned, right? It's not a solution, right? It's just a clarification of something. So when we remove or extract that from our world, the real question is what can we do that we won't get in trouble for that will increase the number of repetition that we can do in that 4-year window? That's really what it comes down to. And if I can decrease cortisol quicker, increase anabolic recovery faster, make sure that my neural drive in the weight room is always 95% of my capability or better, so that I'm not missing a rep, not warming up slowly, not training at a decreased expression of my potential over and over and over again, I by default am becoming anabolically assisted. The difference is it's coming from within instead of from outside sources. But that is what you're trying to do. The idea of optimization of human performance and to super exceed what is already currently in you. And that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to make yourself superhuman based on available sources. Does that make sense?
Yes, you're saying the chronic levels are important, but we don't want those chronic levels to dip.
We never want, yeah. Exactly. We want a baseline and up, always baseline and up, always trying to be in an optimal existence. Okay. Yeah, go for it.
So, say you have athletes that train different times of the day. Is there a timing issue with some of this? Like, if so,
some of it, yeah, man. So here's where, that's actually an excellent question, because where you can play with that a little bit is for the first 3 years of my athletic career, because of scheduling at the school I was at, we didn't get out of the weight room till almost 8 o'clock at night, right? And it was tough, right? So we had a bit of a disrupted cycle. Now, what I would have said to myself retrospectively is I would have said, okay, you can have caffeine at 6 o'clock, right, before you go in to do Olympic lifting, because the one thing that Charles had taught me later on is the process of high metabolic work decreases caffeine effect on the nervous system, and it actually kind of burns it out of you. It's not a perfect world, but it's pretty effective. So what we found is people that took caffeine followed by hard strenuous exercise didn't suffer the same effects of high caffeine consumption. So that was kind of a nice introductory to that in my head. And the other thing I would have done is all of these would have become prioritized in terms of my sleep cycle. So I would have, take a step away from supplementation. Right after I finished training, it would be right into restoration methods, bringing myself back into parasympathetic mode, getting away from sympathetic tissue trauma, unwinding tissue, all those things. And I would have made it more of a scheduled thing, knowing, okay, I need to be in bed at 10, so I need to start unwinding all of this stuff at like 9 o'clock and just getting on an actual schedule of going to bed. And that's the only real way around it. Everything else you can manipulate quite a bit. 2 o'clocks, 4 o'clocks, 3 o'clocks, 6 a.m.s. What ends up happening at 6 a.m. is, depending on whether or not they train fasted or if they have stomach issues, a lot of this stuff ends up being all in the same product anyway, depending on what you're using. So you can kind of jam a lot of this stuff together and just know that this is going to happen before 8 a.m., right? And then this is going to happen at 9 p.m., right? And that's kind of what ends up happening is you start playing with the time scales. Okay. Mm-hmm. All right. So I put this up because I think we have to hammer it home. So this is Michel Eugene Chevreul, right? This is the guy that invented creatine monohydrate that you use in your supplement. That's a current photo, right? Like that is how old he is that they painted him, right? They can't even take a photograph. So creatine monohydrate, if I was to give people one recommendation for athletes that have TBIs and play sports where there's traumatic brain injuries, if you're not having your athlete or the people that are in that world using creatine, you are potentially increasing the risk or decreasing the rate in which you can recover from those traumatic brain injuries. The research now connecting creatine monohydrate to TBIs is become extensive. Anywhere from 5 to 20 milligrams is typically the study values. 5 seems to be effective. Athletes or soldiers or things of that nature that have stage 1, stage 2, or stage 3 TBIs increase executive function as well as memory short and long when they start integrating creatine monohydrate into their diet. The brain part of it is massive. We spent so many years thinking about it, making muscles bigger, that people don't realize the real beauty of creatine monohydrate is in the brain. To the point where, kids that are born with syndrome X that don't even produce creatine monohydrate, they develop all sorts of mental dysfunction, right? There's a direct correlation to that. Now, what's interesting is Chevreul isolated it in 32 to 35. Creatine monohydrate became famous in human performance in 1992 at the Barcelona Olympics. So if you do your research, there's a dead period. Doesn't mean that it wasn't being used. It was just not something that was highly spoken about. Who was using it? Eastern Bloc countries, Russia. They were using a shitload of it. They didn't tell anybody, but it's also why when they release their training journals, it's always a 10x of what they actually do. It's misinformation. And we're so desperate for it that we go and, do the 10X workout and we all blow up and they win another gold medal. Thankfully, we figured that one out, right? But it was the same with supplementation. Some of the early documentation that came out, they were talking about using 50, 60, right? Grams, right? 600,000 milligrams. When all you really need on the high side is 5 grams a day. That's it. That's a high side dose. 20 has been done in studies. For most people, 20 grams will typically give them some stomach distress. But the category of people that it was most beneficial in, and this isn't a judgment call, this is just going to be a fact. People that one of the groups that benefited the most from creatine monohydrate was vegetarian athletes, because they're just not getting it in their diet, right? So if you got a vegetarian athlete or vegan, they will see a significant improvement in performance across the board from creatine monohydrate consumption. So it makes sense, right? What category had the least? Carnivore, right? I mean, it's kind of the writing's on the wall with that, but they still did have benefit, okay? All right, so a little bit of brain health, and I'll read this for those in the back. During a study of 281 participants over 6 separate observations, created that creatine monohydrate had a positive correlation with short-term memory improvement. Okay, you can find that on NLM, NIH. Okay, now the creatine monohydrate upregulated ATP as well as mitochondrial health in the brain, increased mitochondrial activity, decreases a decline in cognitive function. Okay, it is hypothesized that using creatine monohydrate could be a beneficial addition to the recovery process of short and long damage as a result of TBIs. Okay, so get away from the sales pitch of, hey, creatine is for muscles, and start getting people into the sales pitch of creatine will protect your brain, right? Because that's probably where it's more beneficial long-term than any other supplement that you could use in that regard, right? So that's it. So thanks. That's the end of the presentation, but I will now take questions on any topic. Right now it is 1:28. What is our rough time? I lost them all. How much time do we got left for questions? Hey! Yeah. 5 minutes. All right, so question.
You mentioned yesterday an amino profile to help me not be so sad.
Okay, so yeah, the old man amino acid protocol. So when I was going through the recovery from my second Achilles tendon, what I discovered is it was bad luck that I had to have surgery on the same Achilles in 3 weeks. But because of that, I ended up having to go through this horrific process of recovery. And during that, I started going down these weird roads in terms of collagen formulation. And the collagen formulation road took me down like the Pauling method for heart disease, right? And that took me into, okay, so all these things. And what I concluded and what caused the wound to start healing and the tendon to heal was a combination of L-lysine, L-arginine, hydroxyproline, and vitamin C. The vitamin C is essential, okay? Without it, the other three don't have a very good ability to develop collagen. So I always tell people, collagen formulation at the amino acid level occurs in a vitamin C bath. They're synergistic, right? So taking just the amino acids, right? You're gonna have to eat something else to get the vitamin C. But when you have that guaranteed dose of vitamin C along with it, it's going to make sure that you're covering all your bases. Now you can take collagen protein, that's beneficial for day to day. But when we're talking about trying to change tissue health over time, taking the same protocol that they used to get rid of heart disease and the Pauling method was Nobel Prize winning, but it was so effective at reversing heart disease that it got shelved because it was simple. You could take a statin or you could take some amino acids. Well, you know how that turned out, right? Ivermectin. So, right? It's just how the world works. But when we look at it from that standpoint, when you extrapolate that out to what it does for tendons, ligaments, fantastic. And it will decrease the rate in which tissues become brittle, for sure. And in the back? Say again?
What was the second one you listed?
Oh, so lysine, arginine, hydroxyproline, Vitamin C. Oh, glycine. Sorry, don't forget my glycines. Glycine has to be in there. Yeah, glycine as well.
Is there a certain time of day that's best?
Nah, I took them with one of my meals in case they upset my stomach. Yeah.
With vitamin C, you talked about high dosage and IV.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go get an IV.
No, it's
Like, what's the dose that you would recommend?
so that's an interesting thing. It's whatever the dose is that causes you stomach distress, and then you back off. And it's different for every single person. So here's what's weird about that. When I had a non-healing wound on my leg for almost a year, right? They were going to amputate the back half of my leg. When I was an athlete, my post-workout dose was 4 grams, 4,000 milligrams, right? Never had an issue with stomach distress. 5 or 6, probably have to go to the bathroom. While I was healing from that injury, I did not have stomach distress at 15 grams oral. I wouldn't recommend that, by the way, not on day 1. 15 grams a day oral, never had stomach distress, right? Until my leg healed. And then as my leg healed, man, I was like, over the next few weeks, I just saw the dose I could tolerate. It went all the way back down to 4 or 3. And I was like, man, and I remember just thinking back on that, being like, wow, that was weird. That was really weird, because I should have been on the toilet all day at 15 grams. But I just kept increasing it, and I never had an issue until I healed. So what does that mean? I don't know, but that's what happened. So yeah, anywhere from that 2 to 5 grams is pretty standard post-workout. And if it upsets your stomach, you're gonna have to pull back. Never take any of your supplement magnesiums in the citrate form, even though they talk about it a lot as being okay. Outside of the United States, magnesium citrate is a laxative, period, right? That's what its job is, okay? And you'll see it in a ton of supplements. So like Doc's product, his sleep formula, like I said, I think it was biglycinate and oxide, right? One is a salt, one is chelated form. That's the direction you want to go. Like, look for your tartrates, your oxides, your biglycinates, right? Your 8s and magnesium are typically going to be your best bet. All right, one more question.
Yesterday you talked about extending on the cross-body.
Yeah, okay. So when you guys are doing the warm-ups, you did cross crawl. The reason why cross crawl is so beneficial is how we used to utilize it to basically connect hemispheres of the brain and upregulate neurological function, right and left accesses of the body. Now, originally, it was a developmental aspect, and it was really hard to find the research for a Feldenkrais method for autistic children, right? But if you just go in now, because technology has improved this, and just look at cross-crawl patterns for autistic or brain health, and you'll start to find a ton of information, because I was looking at it last night, just trying to refresh my brain of where to find it. And now it's easy to find. Like it used to be, I can't even remember how to spell Feldenkrais. But with the cross-crawl methods, is the effects that it creates is improved mood, improved cognition, improved verbal recall, and decrease in anxious anxiety characteristics in everybody, but mostly children. And what it is and what they think is the aligning of the system and doing those things, for whatever reason, it just aligns the central nervous system and kind of like the sparking off that happens to just kind of bringing it all and getting it into one processing state, right? It's almost like they're disconnected and it brings them together, you know? And it's the disconnection which causes the behavioral issue, you know? It's kind of interesting. All right, last one more and then we're done. Anything? Bueller? That was the last one. I didn't even know it.